Verstappen did not create shock because he crashed. He created shock because a crash may have changed the conversation around Formula One qualifying itself. Because after Verstappen's incident, the source points to something bigger than a lost lap, Russell taking pole, and proposed grid penalty change being discussed after crash. That is not just a bad session. That is a chain reaction. A top driver makes a mistake. A rival takes the opportunity. The qualifying result changes. And suddenly, the sport is asking whether the rules need to change too. That is the kind of moment that leaves a team boss with no easy answer. Because what can Mekies say? Defend the driver too strongly. And it looks like Red Bull does not understand the damage. Criticize him too openly. And it pours fuel onto the pressure. Stay calm. And rivals call it avoidance. React emotionally, and the headline explodes. That is a trap. And the real question is not whether Verstappen can recover his speed. Everyone knows he can. The real question is whether this shocking qualifying moment exposed something much more dangerous. A mistake so costly that Formula One may now be forced to rethink how it punishes drivers when one crash changes the grid. The first block begins with the real reason this moment matters. Not the crash itself. The consequence. Because Formula One has seen crashes before. Drivers push too hard in qualifying all the time. A car snaps. A lap disappears. A session gets interrupted. The driver loses a chance. The team loses a result. And by the next day, the paddock usually moves on. But this one feels different. Because the source connects Verstappen's crash to a proposed grid penalty change. And that turns the incident into something bigger than one driver losing control. It becomes a question about fairness. That is where the pressure starts. If a driver crashes and only ruins his own lap, the punishment is obvious. He loses the lap. He loses a position. He starts lower than he wanted. The damage stays mostly inside his own garage. But if a crash changes the qualifying picture for everyone else, the story becomes much more complicated. What happens if another driver loses a final attempt because of the incident? What happens if a rival benefits because the session cannot continue in the same way? What happens if the driver who caused the disruption still escapes with a better position than the people affected by it? That is a problem Formula One cannot ignore. And that is why Mekies would have no simple answer. Because this is not just about protecting Verstappen. It is not just about defending the team. It is about facing a situation where every possible response creates another problem. If the team says it was just a racing mistake, rivals may say that is not enough. If the team accepts too much blame, it invites even more pressure. If the sport changes the rules, drivers may become more cautious in qualifying. If the sport does nothing, affected teams may feel the system is unfair. There is no clean escape. That is why the silence becomes powerful. Not because Mekies literally said nothing. The source does not confirm that. But because the situation itself creates the kind of pressure where words become dangerous. Every sentence can become a headline. Every explanation can sound like an excuse. Every defense can sound like denial. And every criticism can sound like the team has lost confidence. That is the nightmare for a team boss. Because Verstappen is not an ordinary driver to manage. He is one of the drivers who defines the entire grid. His speed changes the weekend. His mistakes change the conversation. His recovery drives become events. So when he is connected to a crash that leads into a rule debate, the story grows faster than anyone can control. And that is exactly what makes this moment so explosive. Russell taking pole after Verstappen's crash is not just a line in the results. It changes the emotional direction of the weekend. Mercedes gets momentum. Red Bull gets questions. Verstappen gets pressure. And the rest of the paddock gets a reason to look at the rule book. That is a chain reaction. One mistake becomes a lost opportunity. A lost opportunity becomes a rival advantage. A rival advantage becomes a fairness debate. A fairness debate becomes a possible rule change. And suddenly, qualifying is no longer just about who is fastest. It is about whether the sport is punishing disruption properly. That is the first real tension. Because Formula One drivers live on the edge. They have to. A lap in qualifying is not designed to be comfortable. It is designed to be right at the limit, where one extra meter of braking, one fraction of throttle, one slight correction can decide pole position. If the rules become harsher after crashes, drivers will feel that. They may not admit it, but they will. A driver might ask, do I risk the final corner? Do I keep pushing on a messy lap? Do I accept second instead of gambling for pole? Do I back out before the car fully steps away? Those questions change qualifying. And that is why the proposed penalty discussion matters so much. Because the sport has to balance two things that do not naturally fit together. It wants drivers to push, but it also wants fairness when a crash affects others. Push too far toward punishment, and qualify becomes cautious. Push too far toward freedom, and teams may feel a driver can ruin a session without paying enough. That balance is incredibly delicate, and Verstappen's incident appears to have placed that balance under a spotlight. That is where Mekies' position becomes almost impossible. He needs to protect the driver's confidence, because Verstappen still has to race. He needs to protect the team's authority, because the garage cannot look shaken. He needs to respond to the paddock, because the questions will not disappear. And he needs to avoid turning a qualifying mistake into a full weekend crisis. That is a lot for one moment, especially when the driver involved is Verstappen. Because with Verstappen, the expectation is always extreme. People expect him to attack. They expect him to recover. They expect him to turn setbacks into fuel. But that expectation creates its own risk. A driver trying to recover too quickly can overreach. A team trying to prove nothing is wrong can become too aggressive. A strategy built on emotion can turn one mistake into two. That is the danger. The crash already happened. The next mistake is what Red Bull has to prevent, and rivals know it. They will not only watch Verstappen's pace, they will watch his patience. They will watch whether he attacks with control or with anger. They will watch whether the team sounds calm or defensive. They will watch whether the car is allowed to come back into the race naturally, or whether Red Bull tries to force the weekend back into shape. That is what makes this opening block so important. The shock is not only that Verstappen lost a qualifying opportunity. The shock is that the moment may have created pressure in every direction. Pressure on Verstappen to respond. Pressure on Mekies to manage the message. Pressure on rivals to take advantage. Pressure on Formula One to decide whether the rules are still strong enough. And pressure on the entire paddock to answer one uncomfortable question. When a driver's mistake changes more than his own lap, should the consequences change too? The second layer is where Verstappen's mistake stops being a personal problem and becomes a political problem. Because a crash in qualifying is one thing. A crash that changes the grid is something else entirely. That is why the proposed penalty debate matters so much. It suggests the paddock is not only asking whether Verstappen made an error, it is asking whether the current system gives a right consequence when one driver's incident affects the entire session. And that is where the pressure becomes much heavier for Mekies, because he is not just managing a driver after a difficult moment. He is managing the meaning of the moment. If he protects Verstappen too strongly, rivals can say Red Bull is ignoring the wider damage. If he admits too much, the story becomes even bigger. If he says it was simply part of qualifying, affected teams may argue the sport needs better protection. If he says the rules should change, he risks making his own driver the example that forces a change. That is an impossible line to walk. And in Formula One, the words after the incident can become almost as important as the incident itself, because the paddock listens for weakness. Every rival team studies a reaction. Is Red Bull calm? Is Verstappen frustrated? Is the leadership defensive? Is the team trying to move on? Or does it know the story has become bigger than the result? That is why a moment like this can leave a leader lost for words. Not because there is literally nothing to say, because every available answer carries danger. And this is where Russell's pole makes the situation even sharper. If Verstappen crashes, but nobody gains much from it, the story may fade faster. But when Russell claims pole after the incident, the mistake immediately has a visible winner on the other side. Mercedes gets momentum. Red Bull gets pressure. The grid gets a new shape. And the rule debate gets a human example. That changes the emotional temperature. Now the conversation is not abstract. It is not simply, should crashes in qualifying bring stronger penalties? It is, what happens when a Verstappen crash helps open the door for Russell to take pole? That is the kind of story Formula One cannot keep small, because it touches rivalry, fairness, pressure, and championship psychology all at once. For Verstappen, the danger is obvious. He has to respond, but he has to respond correctly. A champion does not erase a mistake by driving angry. He erases it by driving precisely. He takes the frustration, compresses it, and turns it into lap time without letting it spill over into another error. That is much harder than it sounds, because after a shocking qualifying moment, every instinct pushes toward aggression. The driver wants to prove the crash was a one-off. The team wants to recover position. The fans want to come back. The media wants a reaction. The rivals want him to overreach. That is the trap. The fastest response is not always the best response. If Verstappen attacks too early, he could hurt the tires. If he forces a move that is not fully there, the weekend gets worse. If he spends too much energy chasing Russell immediately, he could leave himself vulnerable later. If he waits too long, the pole sitter may control the race. There is no comfortable path back. And that is why the qualifying shock becomes a race problem. Russell on pole can control the first phase. He does not need to chase. He needs to launch cleanly, protect the tires, and make everyone behind take the risks. Verstappen, by contrast, has to balance recovery with discipline. That balance is the entire story, because Verstappen is at his best when he controls the race, when he is the one shaping the pace, forcing others to react, making the gap stable, turning pressure into inevitability. But after a qualifying mistake, he may have to do the opposite. He may have to chase, and chasing changes everything. The car ahead gets cleaner air. The tires can be easier to manage. The driver in front chooses a rhythm. The chasing driver has to work harder, especially if the field is close, and every move carries risk. That is where rivals will look for weakness, not in Verstappen's speed, in his patience. Can he accept that the race may not be won in the first corner? Can he avoid turning frustration into overdriving? Can Red Bull keep the strategy calm while the outside noise grows? Can Mekies hold the team steady when the entire paddock is treating the incident as more than a crash? Those questions matter because one mistake can become two if the response is emotional. That is how weekends unravel. First comes the incident, then comes the pressure to recover, then comes the rush decision, then comes the second loss, and suddenly, a single qualifying shock has become a full competitive collapse. That is what Red Bull has to avoid. But the political side makes that harder, because while the team is trying to prepare for the race, the sport is talking about penalties. That creates a distraction no team wants. Engineers want to focus on setup and strategy. Drivers want clarity. Team leaders want the story contained.